First Amendment prohibits Congress from abridging the freedom of speech. The reason the amendment refers to speech as the freedom of speech is a recognition by the framers that the right to speak freely precedes the existence of the United States as a country. The framers recognized it as a natural right, as Jefferson wrote, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, a natural right which comes to all persons by virtue of our humanity. The right to speak freely does not come from the government, which the big government folks claim. It is an indelible aspect of our humanity. That means the government may not require a license or demand permission for the free speech, and it may not intimidate speakers. It may not punish speech, no matter what the speech asks. Stated differently, no one in the government, any government, may impose a burden on the exercise of the freedom of speech. But not so in Canada. Our neighbors to the north have an entirely different set of rules governing the freedom of speech. Joining me now is John Collison, the spokesman for the Libertarian Party in Canada. John is something of an authority on free speech issues in Canada. John, welcome to Freedom Watch.
Hey, Judge, it's a privilege, and it's John Collison. Thank you.
Thank you, John Collison. I apologize for that. How weak are the protections for free speech in Canada compared to here in the States?
I would say they were almost non-existent when you contrast them with the constitutional outlines you just described. In Canada, free speech is mentioned in our Constitution, but really, and I know you'll appreciate this, it's one of the lies our government tells us that we have free speech. In this country, it's pretty much made up as they go along. There are so many governing departments and agencies and rules and laws that prohibit what you described accurately as the natural right to free speech. So, in a sense, protection of free speech is, as I've always said, pretty much a fantasy, and I found out the hard way back in my days in talk radio in this country.
Does the Canadian system of government, does its public policy, do its courts recognize the concept of natural law as what I just quoted from the Declaration of Independence, that our rights come from our humanity? Or is that view, which is consistent with Great Britain, to which Canada was once subject, or is that view alien to the Canadian government?
I would say it's certainly alien to the Canadian government, and it's funny you mentioned Great Britain. In one sense, the United States is the greatest inheritor of the Scottish Enlightenment, where free speech values were originated, and all of the free speech traditions are valued in the U.S. But in Canada, we are more in the tradition of British government, not in terms of British or English or Scottish Enlightenment values. The government does not recognize free speech as inalienable. They do not recognize that natural law. I'm not a lawyer, but I can tell you from firsthand experience and as a couple of decades of observing it here in this country, it is simply not recognized. There's always a notwithstanding or an excuse to override it. There's always a big but.
As I understand it, the Canadian government has enacted laws which make it a crime to offend someone. So if, for example, a professor in a classroom, or even somebody on a soapbox on the street corner, were to say the Holocaust never existed, and this is all a myth perpetrated by certain groups, a view contrary to all the evidence, but a view that some people entertain, would that be protected speech, or could that person be prosecuted for saying that? That
person can not only be prosecuted, no matter how crazy, that person can be and has been deported. Ernst Zundel is one good example of a wacko who for decades claimed the Holocaust never happened. The guy used to sport a construction helmet but didn't work in the industry. Right. He was finally shipped out to Germany. I mean, you can be deported. You can be barred entry to this country. George Galloway, an anti-war socialist British member of Parliament, was denied entry to Canada because he had expressed sympathy for various Palestinian groups, and some of which are undoubtedly terrorist groups, but, he was barred entry to this country.
Well, then there really is no freedom of speech. I mean, are you permitted to challenge the government's, the prevailing government's views? I mean, suppose the people in the government support the Palestinians, then you can support them, but if the people in the government don't, then you can't?
Yeah,
is it that subjective?
Yes, it is that subjective, because we have had politicians in this country that are anti-Israel or pro-Palestinian. That sort of language would be cool then, but when the government changes and you've got a government that, for instance, is a friend of Israel, like in the Conservative Party, if you offend their side, you're out. The funny thing was, Judge, you're undoubtedly aware that Ann Coulter came to this country. A huge fuss was kicked up on Canadian campuses. All the Conservatives were up in arms. How dare these campus commies want to bar our darling of the right? Yet these are the same people that celebrated when George Galloway was kept out of this country. So it pretty much depends what end of the spectrum you belong to.
I guess it also depends on who's in power, and whoever controls the government gets to decide what speech they want to suppress. How can that be here in North America?
Well, again, I mean, I'll borrow another one of your terms, a nation of sheep. Now, I'm not saying every Canadian is illiberal and a sheep, but we have been conditioned for decades to defer to authority, to defer to government. Remember, Judge, when you guys held a revolution down there that was all about freedom, some people called the United Empire Loyalists said, hey, we're not okay with this. We're splitting. We're going to Ontario, which later became Canada. We don't want any part of this revolution. We don't want too much freedom. So we'll have peace, order, and good government. And those terms leave us wide open to the government's definition of freedom or good government.
We're chatting with John Collison, who's a spokesperson for the Libertarian Party in Canada. Where does all this lead us? I mean, is this likely just to be like a ping pong match? When the Conservatives run the government, they'll suppress people's speech who disagree with them. When the Liberals run the government, they'll suppress the speech of those who disagree with them. There's no standard. There's no way to anticipate what speech the government will accept and what speech it won't.
Yeah, Judge, it really is a minefield. I mean, the guiding principle is if you cause offense, whether it's at the border by trying to bring in the wrong ideas, whether it's on the airwaves by offending an identifiable minority or victim group, if you say the wrong thing in the public square, we have defamation law in this country that is more like the British defamation laws, where it's the person that is offended that doesn't have to prove that there was defamation. In fact, you have to prove that you didn't defame someone.
All right, forgive my ignorance for this question, but is there a First Amendment? Is there anything in the Canadian Constitution, or is there anything in the laws enacted by the Canadian Parliament which would be anything close to Parliament shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech?
No, it says in theory in our Constitution, our Charter of Rights and Freedom, that we have the right of freedom to speech, except when in a democratic society, it can be justifiably ignored. Basically, that's what it says. Now, again, I'm not a constitutional lawyer. We only have the First Amendment as something we can watch from afar in your country. We do not have that entrenched, engraved right to freedom of speech. It is simply not recognized, not in practice, and scarcely even in theory.
Can you be prosecuted for what you're saying sitting in Canada while it's being broadcast down here in the States?
That's a good question. I would tend to think not, because it's being communicated on your airwaves. However, I suppose because many people watch your show and watch Fox up here in Canada on cable, if I were to violate, our laws against protected groups and victims and started discussing dangerous ideas, I suppose it's possible. I mean, I was prohibited from coming back into my own country for 5 hours because they spotted some printed material from LouRockwell.com that made repeated reference to capitalism. The border guard said to me, "What is this propaganda? What are these references to capitalism?"
That is utterly, utterly unbelievable. It's like somebody being prosecuted for reading the Constitution or reading the Declaration of Independence. John Collison, you're a hero for human freedom. Keep up the good fight and come back from time to time and let us know what's going on in Freedom
Judge, I
Watch.
will, but I do want to put some responsibility on you for our free speech problems up here, because you haven't yet, to the best of my knowledge, come up here on a book tour or done some speaking engagements. We get Ann Coulter, we get Sarah Palin, but we haven't had the judge.
Well, you're very kind. Send us an invitation. We'll make our way up there.
Will do, sir.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.